I'm Marilyn Moore. I'm in Bloomington, Illinois to interview George H. Smith. George is a philosopher, an historian, a libertarian, and a scholar of free thought. George first came to my attention through his posts on libertarianism.org. We became friends on Facebook. Then we became friends for real when I made a trip to Bloomington to see the house and garden of Sarah Walker Davis. I invited George to lunch. At lunch, George told me about being an atheist and about how he wrote his first book on atheism when he was 23. He thought I knew this about him already, but I didn't. As I got to know George better, it became clear that he harbors no bitterness about God or religion. He made a choice when he was 23 years old, and he's lived his life accordingly. And George lives a full and interesting life. He's a peaceful, friendly, and open-minded man, and we are friends. I'm not a philosopher, but I am curious, so I read George's book. And after I read it, I wanted to talk about it. And George, who is a nice guy, agreed to answer some questions about atheism for me. I met George at his home, where I recorded our conversation about his childhood, his intellectual development, and the writing of Atheism, the Case Against God. Hi, George. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you doing, Marilyn?
I'm fine, thank you. It's nice to see you.
Thank you.
George, before we get started talking about your book, I'd like to ask you to define a couple of terms that come up again and again in your work. The first one is free thought.
Well, the term free thought has a long provenance, actually. As I recall, it was used as early as the late 17th century, but it became prominent in the early 18th century with a small book or a tract, if you like, a monograph, written by a freethinker named Anthony Collins. In 1713, Collins published this tract. It was called A Discourse of Freethinking. Now, Collins was a protege of John Locke. John Locke himself, the famous English philosopher, of course. Locke himself was sometimes accused of being a freethinker. And he probably fits into that category, although he was what today we might call a liberal Christian, in the sense that he had a very broad conception of what it takes to be a Christian. In those days, it was sometimes called a latitudinarian. And Collins himself was a deist. That is, he was not an atheist. He believed in a God. But like many 18th century free-thinking deists, he believed in a God of nature, a creator God who started the universe, who created the universe, started going, and then left it alone. And the deists in England, at least, were the most prominent freethinkers. The reason they were prominent is because they took offense at the idea of what they call special revelation or personal revelation. That is to say, they believed that whatever God wanted us to know, we can discover with the use of our reason through the laws of nature. The idea that a terrific being like a God would write a book, in effect, or dictate a book to a certain group of people, such as the Jews of ancient Israel or the Christians later on, and confine it to that small group, just struck them as offensive. They just thought it was absurd to think that that's the way an omnipotent, omniscient God would work. So basically, the deists, much more than atheists, and atheists were rather uncommon in the day, were the ones who really went after things like the infallibility of the Bible. They are the ones, like Thomas Paine, much later, who attacked the idea of the infallibility of the Bible by pointing to unfulfilled prophecies, biblical contradictions. The deists were really, in England, as I say, the France is a bit different. In the English Enlightenment, the deists were really the forefront of the free-thinking movement. Now, the term today, free thought and free thinker, is somewhat narrow in scope, I think, because in the 18th century, you could, as I said, even be a liberal Christian and be called a freethinker. The significant, and let me just explain briefly the significance of it. Basically what Collins meant, and he makes this very clear by freethinking, was the moral right to think, however you like, the moral right to doubt specifically. Collins objected to the notion that certain types of doubt were somehow immoral or sinful. And he said we should be free thinkers, meaning we should be free to question, to doubt, to call any dogma, any belief into question, so long as we don't hurt other people through our actions. But beliefs per se are immune to moral evaluation, you might say. They shouldn't be judged moral or immoral. So he meant morally free. And that's pretty much how the term free thinking or free thinker was used throughout the 18th century. Today I have to say that when people call themselves freethinkers, it's a less interesting use of the term. A lot of freethinkers themselves today don't really know the history of the term. And today it just sort of signifies if you're a freethinker, you're basically not a Christian, or you don't belong to any other major religion. You're not a religious person, and if you call yourself a freethinker, you're probably either an atheist or an agnostic. So I would say the term has narrowed in scope. I'm not sure today whether self-proclaimed freethinkers would include liberal Christians under the umbrella label of freethinker, but in the 18th century they did.
Okay, that's interesting, George. I have two quick questions before I move on to the next term. The first one, just to make sure that a free thinker or free thought is something that arose within the context of religion.
Yes.
Okay, and so we use it in opposition to a religious person?
Well, specifically to Christianity.
To Christianity.
Because there were a lot of Christians going around saying that doubt is a type of sin, that you should not doubt the Bible, that you should not doubt the existence of God, that God's watching you, God is judging you, and doubt is sinful. And it's the opposite of faith, and you're supposed to have faith. Well, what's the opposite of faith? Doubt is ultimately the opposite of faith. If you're a doubter, you can't have complete faith, complete confidence in God. So the freethinkers were reacting to that.
Okay.
And they were at the same time proclaiming their right to question biblical claims, biblical dogma. To say that we don't believe in the Bible. We don't believe in the Bible any more than we believe in the Quran, etc.
Okay. And the second, briefly, you mentioned that John Locke was accused of being a freethinker,
Yes.
which makes me think that saying you're a freethinker had some level of danger.
Well, it did, not so much in England as in other countries, but there were people certainly prosecuted for blasphemy well into the 19th century in England. Some very notable freethinkers went to jail. Thomas Paine himself, well, that was I shouldn't say that, his trial was for sedition, not blasphemy, but Richard Carlile, the English freethought publisher, spent about, I believe, around 9 years in prison on blasphemy charges in the early 19th century. His wife, who then took up his printing business, also went to jail. A number of his printers went to jail. So it was still, yeah, you could go to jail. You probably wouldn't be executed, but certainly jail was a realistic possibility. And about Locke, the reason he was suspected was because of his position on the Trinity. The Trinity has its own kind of interesting history in the history of Christianity. If you were an anti-Trinitarian, and the anti-Trinitarians went under different labels. Later they became known as Unitarians. Locke was very circumspect. He was a very cautious man, both in his political publications and in his religious views. He never came out and denied the Trinity. But what he said was that belief in the Trinity is not an essential tenet of Christianity. Locke was called a latitudinarian because of his he gave a lot of latitude. He said basically, as I recall, there were two things that were necessary to be a Christian. One was belief in an afterlife, and the other was the belief that Jesus was the Christ. And he thought things like the Trinity were irrelevant metaphysical disputes that had no bearing on religion, or shouldn't have a bearing on religion. And yet, because of that, but even long before Locke, the Trinity was sort of the litmus test. If you believe in the Trinity, at least you had the chance of being orthodox. But if you denied the Trinity, and that was a very, very big controversy for centuries, then you were suspected of being sort of a closet freethinker. And what Locke said was, in effect, the Trinity is not an essential tenet. You can believe one way or the other on that. Well, a number of prominent theologians went after Locke in print, and he replied to them. There was a very lengthy written debates. You can't be a good Christian if you don't believe in the Trinity and that sort of thing. So it's a complicated historical controversy because it's hard to place oneself back that many centuries and understand why something like the Trinity created such a ruckus among people, but it did.
Okay, thank you. All right, George, then the next term, of course, would be atheism. Can you define atheism?
That's much easier than freethinker or free thought. An atheist, as I use the term, is simply a person who does not believe in the existence of a God, however defined. Atheism is simply the absence or lack of belief in God. Now, lest I make this too simple and give you a short answer for once, I should point out that this is called negative atheism. There is another tradition of atheism. In fact, many philosophers that object, well, that's not really what atheism is. If you look in the dictionary, it indicates a positive denial of God's existence. I'm not sure this is a time in this interview to get into this. Maybe when we get into my book, we can discuss it in more detail. But suffice it to say that the term atheism, as used by freethinkers for at least 2 to 3 centuries, has been the negative definition. If you go back in the history of free thought and read what these people said, beginning in the 18th century especially, but in the 19th century and throughout much of the 20th century, they said, look, when we say we are an atheist, we mean we do not believe. We lack belief in a God. We don't necessarily deny the existence of God, for one reason. We don't even know what the term's supposed to mean. So until it's defined, how can you deny the existence of something until it's defined? So the most generic, most broad sense of the term atheist is a person who does not believe in God, and atheism is not a positive belief, it's simply the absence of a belief.
Okay, all right. Well, George, were you born an atheist? Did you ever have belief in a God?
Well, in a sense, well, I don't want to get into that. I think all children are atheists before they acquire a belief, because they don't have to believe in God. You have to learn about it. But that's not an important kind of atheism. It's, they don't believe in science either, but that doesn't mean anything. Well, so you're asking for some biographical information.
Yeah, tell me about, as a child.
Okay. I didn't come from what I would call a religious family, or not an especially religious family. I could never figure out what my father's beliefs were. He was a career Air Force guy. He went to church. My mother took my brother and I to church, and we went to Sunday school. And he just sort of went along sometimes, sometimes not, I think, just to keep peace in the family. But he just never talked about religion. I don't think he cared about it one way or the other. My mother called herself a Universalist Unitarian. Now that's about as liberal as you can get. As I've often said, the only advantage I could ever figure out about being that religion is you never had to go to church. You can just stay home every Sunday and, well, what religion? I'm a Universalist Unitarian. And, but my mother apparently thought it was a respectable thing to do. But my parents never indoctrinated with religion. But I actually liked church, and I really liked Sunday school. I was raised on Air Force bases, and worked in my God and Country Scout merit badge, and mowed a lot of church lawns for that one. But I never finished it, by the way. I don't want to mislead people about my Boy Scout credentials, but I did work a lot on it. But I threw myself into religion, so as a young boy and throughout, I would say, my junior high school years, that is up and through the 8th grade, I would consider myself to have been a fundamentalist Christian. I mean, churches on Air Force bases were officially non-denominational. They had to accommodate, I mean, the only segregation was for the officers versus the enlisted people. But I considered myself a fundamentalist Christian. And maybe when I get into this later, but yeah, I was religious. And then my beliefs began to change over a period of several years. And by the time I was, I'd say 15 going on 16, I considered myself an atheist.
Okay. All right. Well, as a child, when you thought about God, what did you think about it?
Well, I thought a number of things. When I was younger, it was sort of comforting to think that there was this super being watching out for you. But the thing that really bothered me was what I've referred to many times, beginning I think in my first book, Atheism, the Case Against God, was the omnipresent voyeurist notion. I remember very young, and not to be too explicit, but when a boy hits puberty, there are things he does a lot of that he doesn't necessarily want anyone watching while he does it.
Okay.
And it's very guilt-provoking. And there were times when I was engaged in this particular victimless crime that I just wish God would look away for a while, because, you know, and I was sure he was condemning me. This couldn't be right. It felt too good. It had to be something wrong with it. And it kind of messed me up. And it comes out somewhat in some of the chapters in Atheism, the Case Against God. I talk about guilt a lot in that book. And it's no secret to say that Christianity, some forms of it, can instill a lot of sex-related guilt in children. Now, I've heard the same is true of Judaism, but I don't know that firsthand. I can only speak from my same experience. I would, as for things like Islam, I don't know. But from what I know of Islam, I suspect the same is true there. And there's sort of an anti-pleasure bias. And I know a lot of Christian viewers will disagree with me. No, we're not against pleasure. Well, the type of Christianity I was raised in, there was a definite anti-pleasure bias. And so it took me a long time to get over that.
Okay. So you were monitoring yourself, thinking, well, I'm behaving this way, God's watching me, this can't be right. Did you notice in other people that they might be doing things that God was watching and wouldn't want seen?
Other people. Well,
Adults, for example.
yeah, I didn't think that much about what they were thinking. One thing that I turned into was a sort of overly pious kid, the type
Okay.
that I really don't like anymore. I didn't go around preaching to people. I didn't judge them overtly, but when you're convinced that you're going to heaven and that God's looking out for you, and you look around at other people, especially adults, I was very judgmental of adults. I remember being taken because they had nowhere else to take me when we lived in the Azores. My parents would go to the NCO club and I'd see adults drinking or smoking. I would just get very kind of, not just sort of like I didn't like it, it was very judgmental somehow. And I didn't like that part of myself. I didn't, even as a kid, I didn't like it. Part of the rational part of me is saying, you know, you don't really know the situation of these people, you don't know their context, and they're not roaring drunk, they're not doing anything wrong. But part of me was saying this has to be sinful, and there was that kind of duality in my nature even growing up, and my reason telling me that the way I was reacting in terms of my judgments just didn't make a lot of sense. But, you know, I studied my Bible, and I got a certain slant on the Bible from Sunday school teachers in particular, who were almost always fundamentalists in their orientation. And it just seemed like everything was a sin. If it felt good, it had to be a sin. I mean, that was the way I looked at it as a kid.
Okay. Well, were you happy with yourself then? Is there something about you that led you to think further about religion?
Yeah, there were a number of things. Was I happy with myself? I don't think I've ever been particularly happy with myself, but I was more conflicted then than I was later. I mean, atheism, you know, if I can digress for a second, a lot of people think of deconversion, and I use the word deconversion to mean when you deconvert from a religion to lack of belief. They often discuss it as losing your faith or losing something as if it's a negative. I, and many other atheists, by the way, experience it as a positive. For me, it was a huge lifting of a burden off my shoulders. I mean, I really did experience it that way. It was like, finally. And going back to my earlier point, part of that was knowing that I had this inner sphere of privacy. My thoughts were my own. You know, I could think, I could doubt, I could even have evil thoughts, and I wasn't constantly being watched. Mm-hmm. And that feeling of being watched all the time. And it wasn't, frankly, just, I mean, depending on how you view heaven, I mean, if you look at the history of the ideas of heaven and hell, psychologically they're very interesting. I know I'm digressing, but this may be worthwhile. I think Thomas Aquinas, the famous Catholic saint, a brilliant philosopher, by the way, brilliant theologian, but in his Summa Theologica, and this would be 13th century, has a discussion of whether the saved in heaven can see and witness the sufferings of the damned in hell. So if your children end up in hell, are you aware, while you're in heaven, can you in effect peer over the edge or whatever and watch them in endless agony? Now that's the sort of thing that Christian theologians, medieval theologians especially, talked a lot about. And if you take heaven and hell seriously, you should think about it. I mean, how can you be happy in heaven knowing that people who were close to you, perhaps your wife or your children or your parents, are suffering eternal agony in hell? Now, as I recall, Aquinas concluded that yes, you would be aware of it, and it would increase your own joy, because you would be so ecstatic that basically you weren't down there with them. And I'm probably not doing him quite justice, but it's a very sadistic, I mean, behind this, and I'm not saying Aquinas was a sadistic guy. Of all the Catholic writers in history, I probably admire him the most for various reasons. But the very notion, see, the problem was, well, if you're in heaven, does God eliminate part of your memory? If he cuts off part of your memory, he cuts off part of your identity. So if you don't know that your loved ones, if you don't know about hell, then you're not really the same person. Anyway, what was I supposed to be discussing? Do you remember?
I was asking if you were happy with yourself.
Oh, now I got a little...
As a child.
I was overly introspective as a child, and I'm still overly introspective. A good friend of mine many years ago once said I was pathologically introspective. And when you're like that, and I think a lot of that had to do with Christianity. I mean, I've always identified, and what we discussed this, I believe, at lunch, with figures like St. Augustine. his Confessions, even though I dislike almost everything Augustine stood for. I find him a fascinating character, and that's probably my famous autobiography of all time, the Confessions. And he was pathologically introspective. He was constantly monitoring himself. And so I wasn't particularly happy, but I found life interesting, and I long ago resolved that I'm not an unhappy person, don't get me wrong, I just don't think in those terms.